My name is Riley. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people don't quite notice until they need something done right. I work, I show up, I keep my head down. I don't dominate rooms, I don't raise my voice. I've learned that calm competence often gets mistaken for compliance, and silence gets misread as consent. If you met me before all this happened, you'd probably describe me as steady, dependable, maybe even forgettable, in the way that makes people comfortable. I'm the one managers trust with sensitive tasks, but never ask how I'm holding up. The one coworkers vent to, assuming I'll absorb it without consequence. The one who doesn't make scenes. So no one expects a story like this to come from me. This isn't a revenge story. It's not about shouting matches or dramatic exits or viral takedowns. It's about something quieter and in many ways more unsettling. What happens when the person everyone underestimates stops absorbing the damage and starts paying attention? The moment everything crystallized for me is very specific. My company cut my health insurance the day before my surgery. The cancellation timestamp was 11:59 p.m. The hospital check-in was at 6:30 a.m. Those are just facts. Clean, administrative. No malice written into the email, no explanation offered beyond a policy change, and a line about system updates. What followed wasn't chaos or rage. It was a long, slow emotional journey that moved through disbelief, grief, clarity, and finally a kind of grounded resolve I didn't know I was capable of. This story isn't about me becoming someone else. It's about me becoming precise. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to walk you through that journey from the inside. Not with dramatized villains or heroic speeches, but with the small moments that actually change a person. The meetings that feel off, the emails you reread late at night, the way your body reacts before your mind catches up. You'll hear about the role I was assigned without my consent, the silence I used to survive, and the silence I later used to choose. I'm telling this in my own voice because honesty matters more to me than spectacle. There are things I didn't do perfectly. There were days I stayed quiet longer than I should have. And there were moments when the power I discovered wasn't loud or visible, but irreversible. If you've ever felt invisible at work, or trusted systems that quietly failed you when you were most vulnerable, this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to tell you what I did and what it cost and gave me. So before we go any further, let me ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever realized, too late, that being easy to deal with was costing you more than you knew? Before any of this happened, I knew exactly who I was to them. Not in a dramatic way. No one ever sat me down and explained it. But in the quiet, cumulative way you come to understand gravity. You feel it every day. You adjust your posture around it. At work, I was the reliable one. The person whose name came up when something needed to be fixed discreetly, or finished quickly, or handled without escalating. I was looped into problems late, after decisions had already been made, with a polite note that said, "We just need your help executing." I executed well. That became my identity. I wasn't invisible in the sense of being ignored. I was visible in the way furniture is visible, noticed when useful, taken for granted when stable. People knew I was competent. They trusted my judgment, but they didn't see me as someone whose needs complicated the machine. I rarely took sick days. When I did, I sent detailed handover notes so no one would be inconvenienced. I stayed late without announcing it. I answered emails with clarity and restraint. Somewhere along the way, this consistency hardened into an unspoken contract. Riley can handle it. And because I could, they assumed I always would. In meetings, I was the calm voice that summarized conflict after louder personalities exhausted themselves. I didn't interrupt. I waited. That patience was praised as professionalism, but it also taught people that my input could come last, or not at all. When decisions were announced that affected my workload, my schedule, or my well-being, the assumption was that I'd adapt quietly. I told myself this was maturity, that this was what adults did, that being low maintenance was a virtue. What I didn't realize at the time was how thoroughly that narrative erased my vulnerability. Not just from others, but from myself. Outside of work, people describe me similarly. You're so strong. You always have it together. I don't worry about you. Those comments were meant as compliments. I accepted them that way. But strength, when constantly assigned, becomes a role you're not allowed to step out of. No one asked how I was feeling about my upcoming surgery. It was known, in the abstract. A calendar item, a logistical footnote. I'd mentioned it casually, the way you mention a dentist appointment, because that's how you learn to talk about your own body when you don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. HR had my paperwork. My manager nodded sympathetically when I brought it up weeks earlier. Take the time you need, they said, already glancing at their screen. I believed them because I wanted to, because the system had worked before, because I had always done my part. To them, I was low risk. No drama, no demands, no squeaky wheel. And here's the part that's hardest to admit. I participated in that perception. I trained people how to treat me by what I tolerated, what I softened, and what I explained away. I laughed things off. I said, it's fine, when it wasn't. I didn't escalate because I didn't want to be that person. So when I think back to who I was to them, I don't feel anger. I feel clarity. I was the person they assumed would absorb impact without cracking. The person whose life existed neatly outside the margins of the spreadsheet. They didn't see my fear about the surgery. They didn't see the nights I lay awake calculating recovery time against sick leave balances. They didn't see the quiet hope I had that, just once, the system would hold me the way I had held it. To them, I was steady ground. And steady ground, people forget, can still break. The first small cut didn't look like a wound. That's why no one noticed it. That's why I didn't name it right away. It came as an email. Brief, neutral, almost polite. A routine update about benefits administration, new vendor, minor changes. Nothing that required action on my part, according to the message. I remember reading it at my desk mid-morning, coffee cooling beside my keyboard, thinking only that I should probably skim it more carefully later. I didn't, not yet. At that point, my surgery was still weeks away. Far enough in the future to feel abstract, like a date penciled lightly on the calendar of my body. I trusted that the infrastructure around me, the policies, the people paid to manage them, was stable. I had no reason to. I'd been insured continuously for years. No gaps, no issues. I was, again, low risk. A few days later, during a team meeting, someone joked about how complicated healthcare paperwork was. Laughter circled the table. I smiled at the right moment. When someone said, "At least HR handles that stuff," I nodded along. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have. The first real cut happened quietly, almost invisibly. I emailed HR with a simple question, just a confirmation really, about coverage continuity given my upcoming medical leave. I worded it carefully, friendly, non-alarmist. I didn't want to sound anxious. I didn't want to imply mistrust. The reply took longer than usual. When it came, it was short. Too short. A generic assurance that all eligible employees will transition seamlessly under the new provider. No direct mention of my surgery, no confirmation number, no contact person. Just a paragraph that could have been sent to anyone. I told myself it was fine. This is what I mean when I say the disrespect was subtle. There was no denial, no rejection, just a soft deflection that required me to do extra emotional labor to feel secure. And because I was used to being the person who smoothed things over, I did that labor myself. I didn't follow up immediately. I didn't want to be annoying. I didn't want to create work for someone else. I rationalized the discomfort the way I always had. They're busy. It's a big transition. I'll check again later. Later came in the form of a calendar reminder I'd set for myself, 2 weeks before surgery, to confirm pre-authorization. That was when the unease sharpened. Not fear yet, just a thin, precise awareness that something wasn't lining up. I called the number listed in the email footer. After navigating menus and holding music, I reached someone who didn't have access to my file. They suggested I contact the insurance provider directly. The provider redirected me back to HR. It was a loop, clean, bureaucratic. No one was rude. No one raised their voice. And yet, with every pass through that loop, I felt a tiny erosion of certainty. This was the first small cut, realizing that responsibility was being quietly shifted onto me at a moment when I had the least capacity to carry it. Not maliciously, not intentionally, but effectively. When I mentioned the confusion to my manager in passing, they frowned sympathetically and said, "I'm sure it'll sort itself out." Then they moved on to the next agenda item. That was it. That was the entire intervention. I nodded. I always nodded. Inside, something registered. Not outrage, not panic, just a note filed away. When it matters to you, it is still optional to them. I didn't escalate. I didn't demand answers. I didn't document the exchange yet. I went home that evening and made dinner, folded laundry, and prepared my body for a procedure I was trying not to think about too much. I told myself this was how adulthood worked. Minor frictions, easily resolved. But the cut was there, small, clean, and I felt it every time I told myself I was overreacting, because deep down, I knew this wasn't about insurance. It was about how easily my vulnerability had been brushed aside, not out of cruelty, but out of convenience. And convenience, I was beginning to understand, can be just as dangerous. Once something happens more than once, it starts to feel like a pattern. And once it feels like a pattern, your mind gets involved, not to protect you, but to make it survivable. After that first small cut, I became more alert, but not more assertive. There's a difference. I notice things. I track them quietly, and then I explain them away. The follow-up emails about benefits were slow, always arriving just late enough to make me feel unreasonable for pressing. When I asked for written confirmation, I received screenshots of policy summaries instead of documents with my name on them. When I asked who I should contact if something went wrong, I was told, "It shouldn't." That phrase, "it shouldn't," became a kind of lullaby. It soothed without reassuring. It implied that my concern was hypothetical, theoretical, and unnecessary. And because I didn't want to be seen as difficult, I accepted it. This is how disrespect gets normalized, not through obvious cruelty, but through repetition paired with plausible deniability. I started timing my questions carefully. Never at the end of the day, never on a Friday, never when I knew someone was overwhelmed. I rewrote emails 3 or 4 times to make them sound lighter, more cooperative. I added smiley language where it didn't belong. I apologized for asking things I was entitled to know. No one told me to do this. I did it instinctively, the way you learn to soften your footsteps in a house where noise feels unwelcome. Meanwhile, the surgery date got closer. My body began to feel heavier, more present. Pain became less abstract. I scheduled pre-op appointments. I filled out hospital forms that asked for insurance details. And each time I hesitated before typing them in, like I was lying to myself. When I called the insurance provider again, they still couldn't confirm coverage beyond the end of the month. "Your employer hasn't finalized the transition file," they said. Neutral tone. Not their problem. Understandable. I emailed HR again. This time, I attached the hospital's request for pre-authorization. I highlighted the date. I used bullet points. I stayed polite. The reply came the next day. "We're still waiting on final system updates. Coverage should remain active. Let us know if the provider needs anything else." I stared at that sentence longer than I should have. Should remain active. Not will, not confirmed, should. I felt a flicker of something, anger maybe, but I extinguished it quickly. Anger felt impractical, inconvenient. I told myself that stressing wouldn't help my recovery, that my job was to stay calm, stay healthy, and trust the process. This is the quiet violence of normalization. You begin to prioritize the comfort of the system over the signals of your own body. I told myself stories to make it make sense. HR was understaffed. The vendor change was complicated. I was lucky to even have insurance. Other people had it worse. I wasn't special. Each of these thoughts contained a grain of truth. Together they formed a net that kept me still. What I didn't realize was that every time I rationalized away a delay or an omission, I was teaching myself that my fear didn't deserve urgency, that my pain could wait, that my risk was acceptable collateral. Coworkers asked how I was doing. I said, "Fine." They said, "Let us know if you need anything." I smiled and said, "I will." We all knew I wouldn't. By the time the week of surgery arrived, the uncertainty had become background noise. I functioned around it, packed my hospital bag, set my out-of-office message, cleared my task list so no one would be inconvenienced while I was gone. I was proud of how composed I was, how little trouble I caused, and that's the part that hurts to look back on. I mistook endurance for dignity. I believed that if I could just carry this quietly, it would resolve itself, that the system would reward my patience with care. Instead, my patience made me easy to overlook. By then, the disrespect no longer felt like an event. It felt like the air. And air, when it's thin enough, can suffocate you without ever announcing itself. There's a moment when you stop asking why something is happening and start seeing how it's structured. For me, that moment came quietly, without confrontation, without anyone saying the wrong thing out loud. I realized I had been assigned a role, not formally, not maliciously, but clearly. I was the reliable one, the adaptable one, the person who would absorb uncertainty so others didn't have to. When something was unresolved, it didn't become urgent until it disrupted someone louder, someone higher up, someone whose discomfort carried weight. Mine did not. That wasn't a personal failure. It was a system doing exactly what it had learned it could do. I saw it in how my concerns were routed, never escalated, just redirected, never denied, just delayed. I saw it in how my surgery was treated like a scheduling inconvenience rather than a physical event with consequences, a thing to be worked around, not worked for. The role I was assigned was simple: be reasonable. Reasonable people don't panic. Reasonable people wait. Reasonable people understand that transitions take time and that processes are imperfect. Reasonable people don't demand written confirmation when verbal assurances should be enough. And I had been reasonable for a very long time. Once I saw the role, I started noticing how consistently I was cast in it. In meetings, I was the one asked to help smooth this over. When tensions rose, eyes flicked toward me, expecting me to translate emotion into action. When something went wrong, it was assumed I'd fix it quietly rather than ask why it broke. No one asked if I wanted that responsibility. It had simply become mine. What struck me most was how the role erased my context. I wasn't a patient preparing for surgery. I was an employee navigating a benefits change. I wasn't a person with a body that would soon be cut open and stitched back together. I was a line item in a system update. And because I had never disrupted that framing before, no one thought to adjust it now. I remember sitting at my desk late one afternoon, rereading the last HR email, and feeling something settle in my chest. Not despair, recognition. The understanding that if something went wrong, it wouldn't be treated as an emergency until it became someone else's problem. That's when I stopped expecting care to arrive on its own. Up until then, I'd believed that being good, being cooperative, being patient, created a kind of moral credit. That was when I finally needed something. The system would recognize the investment and respond accordingly. But systems don't feel gratitude. They respond to pressure, visibility, and risk. And I had made myself low on all three. This wasn't about villains or cruelty. No one woke up thinking, let's harm Riley. They woke up thinking about deadlines, budgets, and inboxes. My role made it easy to push my issue to the bottom of the pile without guilt. Once I understood that, something shifted internally. I didn't feel angry at them. I felt sober about myself. I'd been performing reliability at the cost of legibility. I'd made my needs so easy to ignore that ignoring them felt normal. That realization didn't come with a plan yet. It didn't make me brave or bold overnight, but it did something more important. It broke the illusion that silence was neutral. I saw clearly that staying quiet wasn't keeping the peace. It was maintaining a structure that only worked if I stayed small. The surgery was days away. The insurance question was still unresolved. And for the first time, I stopped telling myself that this was just how things were. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't send a sharply worded email. I simply stopped assuming that being reasonable would protect me. That was the moment I stepped out of the role they'd assigned and into a pause. A deliberate stillness where I observed instead of absorbed. And in that stillness, something new began to form. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no raised voices, no final straw that snapped loudly in half. It was quiet, almost ordinary, which is why it took me a moment to recognize its significance. It was the evening before my surgery. I was at home, moving slowly, deliberately. the kind of careful movement you adopt when your body is already negotiating pain and anticipation. My hospital bag was packed and resting by the door. My alarm was set for early morning. Everything I could control, I had controlled. Out of habit more than urgency, I checked my email one last time. That's when I saw it. A notification from the insurance portal. Automated, impersonal, timestamped 11:59 p.m. Coverage terminated. For a few seconds, my brain refused to process the words. I reread them, looking for context, for clarification, for anything that suggested this was a mistake. There was none. Just a status change and a reference number. The hospital check-in was at 6:30 a.m. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. What I felt instead was a kind of hollow quiet, as if all the air had been pulled out of the room. My body reacted before my emotions caught up. My hands went cold, my jaw tightened, my heart slowed in a way that felt unnatural. This was the moment all the shoulds collapsed. It shouldn't happen. It should remain active. It should sort itself out. None of that mattered anymore. The system had made its choice, cleanly and without ceremony. I sat down on the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. My phone was in my hand, but I didn't know who to call. HR wouldn't see an email until the morning. The insurance provider's office was closed. The hospital wouldn't negotiate policy status at check-in. I thought about all the times I'd been patient, all the emails I'd softened, all the discomfort I'd absorbed to avoid being a problem. And something inside me went still. Not numb, not broken, just clear. I understood in that moment that my silence had not protected me. It had made this possible, not because I deserved it, but because no one had been forced to reckon with my reality. This wasn't a betrayal in the cinematic sense. No villain monologue, no slammed door, just a system doing what it does when no one is watching closely enough. I made a decision that night, sitting in the half-light of my bedroom, with my surgery hours away and my insurance gone. I would never again confuse being quiet with being safe. That decision didn't come with a plan yet. I didn't know what I would do, only what I wouldn't do. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't explode. I wouldn't make this emotional for people who had treated it as administrative. I slept eventually. Not well, but enough. In the morning, I went to the hospital. I told the intake desk the truth. Calmly. There were forms. There were pauses. There were looks exchanged above my head. The surgery went forward after a long, quiet wait and a stack of provisional paperwork that felt heavier than my overnight bag. I lay in recovery later, groggy and aching, listening to the beeping of machines, and I felt something settle permanently in me. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about agency. I had seen with absolute clarity how little protection being easy actually offered, and once you see that, you can't unsee it. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. But from that moment on, my silence was no longer automatic. It was a choice. After the surgery, everything slowed down. My body demanded rest in a way that couldn't be negotiated, and for the first time in years, I was physically forced to stop performing usefulness for other people. That stillness changed how I listened. Messages from work came in. Polite, well-meaning, carefully worded. Hope you're recovering well? Let us know if you need anything. HR emailed to say they were looking into the insurance issue and would update me soon. I replied to none of them immediately. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't passive aggression. It was a restraint. Before, silence had been something that happened to me. I stayed quiet because it felt safer, smoother, and more professional. Now, I was quiet because I was watching. From my bed, phone resting beside me, I reread the emails I'd saved. I checked timestamps. I noted language. I began to see patterns I'd ignored before. How certainty was always implied but never documented. How responsibility was diffused through phrases like should, likely, and in progress. They mistook my silence for the same thing they always had, endurance. No one escalated urgently. No one called. No one acknowledged the gravity of what had happened. The system moved at its usual pace, assuming I would wait. And I did wait, but not the way they thought. I requested copies of every benefits document on file. Not angrily, not urgently, just a simple written request. I asked for timelines, for confirmation of eligibility periods, for notices of termination. Each response took time. Each answer was partial, and with every exchange, my understanding deepened. I wasn't invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because I had made my boundaries invisible. As I recovered, I began to document everything. Dates, names, wording, not with the intention of confrontation, but with the clarity of someone who no longer wanted to rely on memory or goodwill. It surprised me how quickly my emotional charge faded once I stopped trying to be understood. I wasn't seeking an apology. I wasn't seeking validation. I was seeking accuracy. Silence, I learned, can be disarming when it's no longer defensive. When I eventually responded, my emails were calm and precise. Short sentences, direct questions, no apologies for asking, no emotional framing, just facts. The tone shift was subtle, but it registered. Replies became more careful. People seed others. Language firmed up. Processes that had been pending for weeks suddenly moved. Not because I raised my voice, but because I made myself legible in a way I hadn't before. They still underestimated me. They assumed I was recovering, distracted, eager to put the ordeal behind me. They assumed my quiet meant I wanted resolution, not reckoning. I let them believe that, because this time silence wasn't about self-erasure. It was about timing. I was no longer trying to be easy to deal with. I was becoming exact. And exactness, I would learn, is far more unsettling to a careless system than anger ever could be. What they never noticed was how much attention I paid once I stopped asking to be reassured. Recovery gave me time. Not just physical rest, but cognitive space. The kind that lets you zoom out and see structures instead of moments. While they assumed I was focused on healing and getting back to normal, I was learning how things actually worked. I read everything, not just my own benefits documents, but the policy language behind them. I learned how eligibility windows were defined, how termination notices were supposed to be issued, what system transitions are legally required in terms of employee notification. I didn't skim. I studied. I pulled old emails from my archive. I lined them up chronologically. I noticed where language shifted from certainty to assumption, where responsibility changed hands without acknowledgement, where deadlines passed without documentation. What stood out wasn't malice. It was sloppiness protected by hierarchy. No one had intended to leave me uninsured hours before surgery. But intent didn't erase impact. And more importantly, intent didn't erase accountability. I started requesting things in writing that had previously been handled verbally. Every request was polite. Every response was saved. I never accused. I never implied wrongdoing. I simply asked for confirmation. Can you confirm the date coverage was terminated? Can you provide the notice sent to me prior to termination? Can you clarify which policy governs coverage during provider transitions? Each question was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a map. What they never noticed was that I had stopped trying to protect them from their own inconsistencies. Before, I would have filled in the gaps myself, explained away contradictions, and accepted ambiguity as unavoidable. Now I let the gaps sit there, visible. I also noticed who responded quickly and who didn't, who looped in legal language, who suddenly became careful about phrasing, who stopped using should, stopped using. There was a moment late one afternoon when I realized I no longer felt afraid of the system. I understood it, and understanding removed its mystique. This wasn't about catching someone out. It was about seeing clearly where responsibility actually lived. And once I saw that, I stopped internalizing what never belonged to me. They still thought of me as compliant, as the person who wouldn't escalate, as someone grateful just to be heard. They didn't notice the shift from emotional processing to structural analysis. They didn't notice that I was positioning myself, not aggressively, not theatrically, but deliberately. That I was creating a record that told the story without commentary. What they never noticed was that preparation doesn't announce itself. It looks like patience. It looks like recovery. It looks like someone who's moved on. But patience, when combined with clarity, becomes leverage. And I was almost ready to see exactly how much. The private reveal didn't come as a rush of triumph. There was no moment where I leaned back and thought, got it. It was quieter than that, almost anticlimactic. It came when I finally laid everything out side by side. The policy language, the transition timeline, the emails I'd received, and the ones I hadn't. The timestamp on the termination notice. 11:59 p.m., the hospital check-in time. 6:30 a.m. Individually, each piece could be explained away. Together, they told a story that no amount of polite phrasing could soften. I realized then that my coverage hadn't just lapsed accidentally. It had been terminated without the required notice window during an administrative transition that explicitly required continuity of coverage for active employees on medical leave. That wasn't an interpretation, that was written, black and white. What struck me most wasn't the severity of it. It was how easy it would have been for this to disappear if I'd been louder or messier. If I'd panicked, if I'd threatened, if I'd made it emotional, the narrative would have shifted to damage control. Instead, by staying precise, I had preserved the facts exactly as they were. This was the reveal. I wasn't powerless. I just hadn't been positioned. And positioning, I was learning, had nothing to do with volume. I sat with that knowledge for a while. Days, not hours. I didn't tell anyone. Not coworkers, not friends. This wasn't something I needed validated. I needed to understand what it meant to hold information without immediately spending it. For the first time, I felt something close to respect for myself. Not because I'd endured, but because I'd paid attention. There was no urge to expose or embarrass. No fantasy of confrontation. What I felt was clarity about choice. I had options now. Real ones. And each option came with consequences I could finally see. I understood how systems respond when risk becomes visible. How language changes when documentation exists. How quickly indifference turns into concern when ambiguity disappears. This wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about deciding what kind of ending I could live with. The reveal wasn't loud. It didn't glow. It simply settled into place like a missing piece. And once it did, I knew there was no going back to the version of me who hoped things would work out on their own. I closed my laptop that night and slept deeply for the first time since before the surgery. Not because it was over, but because I finally knew where I stood. Once you truly understand a situation, you stop asking what's fair and start asking what's aligned. That was where I found myself. Not angry, not desperate, but standing very still at the center of a choice I could no longer avoid. The decision point didn't arrive as a dramatic fork in the road. It unfolded slowly, like a map, revealing itself layer by layer. And the longer I sat with it, the more I realized that the hardest part wasn't knowing what I could do. It was accepting what each option would make me become. There were very clearly 3 paths forward. The first path was restoration. Accept the apology that would eventually come. Allow HR to correct the error retroactively, reimburse what they could, and frame the entire incident as an unfortunate administrative oversight. This path offered comfort. It promised normalcy. It allowed everyone, including me, to return to a familiar story. Mistakes happen, systems fail, good intentions prevail. I could already imagine the language. We're so sorry this slipped through the cracks. This isn't how we do things. We value you. If I chose this path, I would be praised for my understanding, for my grace, for being so reasonable about it. My reliability would be reaffirmed. My reputation as someone easy to work with would remain intact. But I also knew what this path required from me. Selective amnesia. I would have to forget the hours before surgery, when I sat alone, uninsured, realizing how fragile my safety actually was. I would have to pretend that trust, once broken at that level, could be restored with polite language and delayed fixes. I would have to teach the system, again, that the cost of mishandling my body and my well-being was manageable. That path asked me to be who I used to be. The second path was escalation. This was the path people often mistake for strength, filing formal complaints immediately, looping in senior leadership, using sharp language, forcing urgency through discomfort, making the problem loud enough that it couldn't be ignored. There was a part of me that understood the appeal of this option. Escalation promises visibility. It creates motion. It often produces faster responses, quicker concessions. It also offers emotional release, the satisfaction of finally being heard. But I had learned something important during recovery. Loudness shifts attention. If I escalated emotionally, the narrative would pivot. The focus would move away from what happened and toward how I reacted. My tone would be analyzed. My motives are questioned. The system would protect itself by reframing me as distressed, upset, maybe even unstable. I would become the variable. And I didn't want that. I didn't want my pain to be used as a distraction from the facts. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want to be managed. That left the third path, the quiet one. This path didn't involve confrontation in the traditional sense. It didn't rely on anyone admitting fault or expressing remorse. It didn't seek to repair the relationship or preserve comfort. Instead, it involved proceeding as if clarity, not harmony, was the primary goal. It meant continuing to document, continuing to ask precise questions, continuing to build a record that required no emotional interpretation. It meant choosing actions that acknowledged reality rather than hoping it would soften. This path was irreversible because it changed the relationship at its foundation. Once you stop prioritizing being understood and start prioritizing being accurate, you can't go back. You stop playing the role that made the system comfortable. You stop being safe. I spent days making this decision, longer than I expected to. Not because I was afraid, but because I respected the weight of it. I knew that whatever I chose would ripple outward, not just professionally, but internally. I thought about my body, about how it had been opened, repaired, and stitched back together while my coverage status existed as a question mark no one rushed to resolve. I thought about how close I'd come to being asked to make an impossible decision at check-in, delay surgery, or assume catastrophic financial risk. I thought about how calmly I'd handled it, how practiced I was at swallowing fear without letting it inconvenience anyone. And then I asked myself a question I had never asked before. What if that calm wasn't strength? What if it was conditioning? The realization was uncomfortable, not because it accused anyone else, but because it required honesty from me. I saw clearly that my past behavior had been optimized for survival within the system, not for dignity within myself. I had learned to reduce friction, to smooth edges, to absorb instability, so others wouldn't have to adjust. That strategy had worked, until it didn't. The irreversible path wasn't about punishing the system. It was about withdrawing my participation in my own diminishment. Choosing it meant accepting that I might no longer be seen as easy, that I might become inconvenient, that doors might quietly close, conversations might change tone, and opportunities might subtly reroute. I sat with that reality carefully, and then something surprising happened. I realized I wasn't afraid of losing what that system offered me, because what it offered had already proven conditional. The anxiety I'd been carrying since the night before surgery wasn't about consequences. It was about misalignment, about living in a way that required constant self-erasure to function smoothly. Once I saw that, the decision stopped feeling dramatic. It felt clean. So I chose the quiet, irreversible path. I didn't inform anyone of my choice. There was no announcement, no email marking a shift in tone. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, everything did. Everything. From that point forward, I stopped orienting my actions around being perceived as reasonable. I oriented them around being exact. Every step I took was deliberate. Every request was documented. Every response was evaluated not for its emotional impact, but for its structural meaning. I accepted that this path might cost me comfort, but it gave me something I had never had before in a professional setting: self-trust. There is a profound calm that arrives when you stop bargaining with yourself, when you no longer ask, "What will they think?" and start asking, "What do I know?" I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for apologies, not for explanations, not for reassurance. I had crossed a line, not outwardly, but internally. And from that moment on, the outcome was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I was shaping. Once the decision was made, movement didn't look like action the way people usually imagine it. There were no dramatic emails, no calendar invites with heavy titles, no sudden shift in demeanor that would have alerted anyone that something fundamental had changed. I moved in silence. On the surface, I appeared cooperative, professional, focused on recovery and eventual return. I thanked people for checking in. I kept my tone even. I never referenced the depth of what I now understood. That was the point. Behind the scenes, everything I did became intentional. I requested complete copies of my employment records, not framed as suspicion, but as personal documentation. I asked for benefit plan summaries across multiple years, not just the current one. I requested clarification on internal procedures regarding vendor transitions and employee notification requirements. Each request was reasonable. Each was difficult to refuse without creating a record of refusal. I also stopped volunteering context. Before, I would explain why I needed something, soften the request with personal details, and reassure people I wasn't upset. Now, I let the request stand on its own. Facts don't need justification. The change unsettled people more than anger ever could have. Responses began to include additional recipients, HR looped in legal. Language became precise, almost cautious. Where emails once said should, they now say will or has been. Timelines appeared, documentation materialized, all without me raising my voice. What no one noticed was how little I asked for directly. I wasn't demanding outcomes. I was collecting structure, understanding process, mapping responsibility. I reviewed state and federal labor guidance on benefits continuity during medical leave. I didn't quote it to anyone. I didn't threaten. I simply understood where my experience sat within a broader framework that existed regardless of my emotions. The silence worked because it didn't provoke defense. There was nothing to push against, no accusation to refute, just a growing awareness, on their side, that this situation was no longer vague. At the same time, I prepared for practical consequences. I updated my personal financial records. I documented medical expenses carefully. I made contingency plans without panic. This wasn't about expecting the worst. It was about refusing to be caught unprepared again. When someone finally acknowledged, indirectly, that the lapse should not have occurred, I thanked them, calmly. I didn't respond with relief or indignation. I didn't ask what they were going to do about it. They began to tell me anyway. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about refusing to perform your process for an audience. It's about letting clarity do the work that emotion used to. By the time anyone realized this wasn't going to resolve quietly, it was already too late to reframe it as a misunderstanding. The consequences had begun, not because I forced them, but because I stopped absorbing them. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They rarely do. They came in subtle disruptions, small shifts that signaled something had changed, even if no one said it out loud. Responses slowed, then sped up. Emails that once sat unanswered were suddenly returned within hours. People who had never joined these conversations before appeared quietly in CC lines, their presence unannounced but unmistakable. The system had started to feel risky. What changed wasn't tone, it was attention. I noticed how carefully words were chosen now, how statements were framed with qualifiers and references, how questions I asked weeks earlier were suddenly treated as urgent. Nothing about my language had escalated, but the structure around me had tightened. That's how you know consequences have begun, not when someone apologizes, but when behavior changes. There was an offer to review the situation holistically. Another is to ensure alignment going forward. I acknowledged both without reacting. I didn't accept or reject anything. I simply noted. Internally, processes were being revisited. I could tell by the questions coming back to me, requests for clarification that had nothing to do with my experience, and everything to do with documenting theirs. They were no longer just responding to me. They were preparing for someone else. And that was enough. Coworkers sensed it before they understood it. Conversation shifted. People asked how my recovery was going with an extra layer of care, as if trying to recalibrate a relationship they suddenly realized they hadn't been fully present in. I didn't correct them. I didn't offer reassurance. I had learned that clarity doesn't require comfort. The most telling consequence was what didn't happen. No one tried to minimize the lapse anymore. No one used the word should. No one implied that I was overreacting. The narrative had changed from "this is unfortunate" to "this needs to be handled correctly." That shift was irreversible. I felt no satisfaction watching it happen. No vindication. Just a steady awareness that the system now understood what it hadn't before. I was no longer a low-risk variable, and once that understanding exists, everything else follows. By the time the urgency fully surfaced, it was already too late to undo what had been set in motion. That's the thing about systems. They're excellent at reacting, but terrible at rewinding. Once attention finally locks in, it often arrives after the moment where a clean repair was possible. I could feel the shift clearly now. The language in emails changed again, this time carrying a faint edge of concern. Not panic, never that, but a careful alertness, like people realizing they were standing closer to a ledge than they'd thought. There were meetings I wasn't invited to, but could sense happening. I knew because questions started coming in clusters. Requests for clarification arrived back to back, each one slightly more detailed than the last. They weren't about my experience anymore. They were about exposure. Someone asked whether I had received any formal notice of termination. Someone else asked if I'd been informed verbally of coverage changes prior to the lapse. Another wanted to know whether I'd incurred out-of-pocket medical costs as a result. These were not casual questions. I answered each one plainly. I didn't editorialize. I didn't speculate. I stated what had happened, when it had happened, and what documentation existed. Nothing more. That restraint made the situation impossible to spin. At some point, someone tried to shift the conversation toward resolution. There was mention of reimbursement, of internal corrections, of learning opportunities. All of it arrived wrapped in professional concern, but underneath was a subtle hope that this could still be framed as something fixable. I listened, I acknowledged, I did not agree. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, but because I understood something they were just beginning to realize. Repair requires timing, and that window had closed the moment my insurance was terminated hours before surgery. You can't retroactively give someone safety. You can't undo the fact that, when it mattered most, the system failed silently. There was a brief period where people seemed genuinely confused by my calm. They expected anger, or at least relief. Instead, they were met with neutrality, not indifference, precision. That's when the regret crept in. It showed up in the careful phrasing of emails, in the repeated offers to make this right, in the subtle defensiveness that accompanies the realization that the problem isn't just operational, it's structural. What they wanted was closure. What they needed was accountability. And those are not the same thing. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten action. I didn't say what I was going to do next. I didn't have to. By then, the consequences were no longer in my hands. They were embedded in the record. Too late to fix it didn't mean nothing could be done. It meant nothing could be undone. And once that truth settled in, the room, virtual or otherwise, went very quiet. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was a meeting scheduled, brief, precisely titled, with just enough people invited to signal that this was no longer routine. I joined from home, still not fully recovered, camera on, posture neutral. No notes in front of me. I didn't need them. What struck me immediately was the tone. Careful, measured, no one rushed to speak. They thanked me for my time. They acknowledged the difficulty of my experience. They used words like regrettable and unintended. I let them finish. When it was my turn, I didn't recount the emotional weight of that night. I didn't describe the fear or the physical vulnerability. I didn't need to. I stated the sequence of events. I named dates. I referenced the timestamp. I confirmed the lack of prior notice. I clarified what documentation existed and what didn't. My voice stayed even. My language stayed plain. I wasn't there to convince anyone of how I felt. I was there to confirm what had happened. There were pauses after I spoke. Small ones. The kind that appear when no one is sure what else can be added without making things worse. Someone asked what outcome I was seeking. I took a moment, not for effect, but because the question deserved accuracy. I'm not asking for an apology, I said, and I'm not asking for reassurance. I needed to understand how this occurred and whether the system recognizes the risk it created. That answer landed differently than anger would have. They responded with explanations. Vendor transition issues, misaligned timelines, internal assumptions. None of it contradicted what I already knew. None of it changed the record. I listened, I nodded, I didn't argue. The meeting ended without resolution, and that was intentional on both sides. They weren't ready to say what would happen next. I didn't need them to. What mattered was this. The dynamic had shifted permanently. I was no longer someone they were managing emotionally. I was someone they had to respond to structurally. Confrontation without heat is unsettling because it leaves no space for deflection. There's nothing to calm down, nothing to placate. Only facts sitting where everyone can see them. When the call ended, I closed my laptop and felt no rush of triumph. Just a steady certainty that I had said exactly what needed to be said, no more, no less. Oh, and that was enough. I'm not who I was before this happened, but I am also not hardened by it. For a long time after the surgery, I thought change would feel dramatic. like a shedding or a severing. Instead, it felt more like alignment, the quiet relief of no longer betraying myself in small habitual ways. I still work, I still speak calmly, I still listen carefully, but I no longer confuse those traits with compliance. What changed most is how I relate to systems. I no longer assume they will protect me just because I've been reliable. I no longer offer my silence as proof of resilience. I understand now that structures respond to clarity, not character. That understanding didn't make me cynical, it made me precise. I set boundaries without explaining them. I ask for confirmation without apologizing. I document without assuming bad intent, and without assuming good intent either. I let my needs exist without translating them into something more palatable. This didn't make me louder, it made me legible. The fear that once kept me quiet, the fear of being seen as difficult, emotional, or expendable, lost its grip when I realized how conditional safety had always been. I wasn't losing protection by speaking clearly. I was losing an illusion by staying silent. I also don't carry bitterness. Not because what happened was acceptable, but because bitterness would tie me to a version of myself that survived by shrinking. I don't need that version anymore. What I carry instead is discernment. I notice when language avoids responsibility. I notice that urgency appears only after risk becomes visible. I notice when kindness is offered in place of accountability, and I decide deliberately how much access that earns. I didn't win anything in a cinematic sense. There was no moment of public acknowledgement, no sweeping reform announced in my name. But something more important happened quietly. I stopped participating in my own minimization. That change doesn't show up on a resume. It doesn't get applauded, but it shapes every interaction that follows. I'm still calm, still measured, still thoughtful. But now, my silence is never assumed. When I think about everything that happened, I don't return to the night my insurance was terminated, or even the morning of the surgery. Those moments were pivotal, but they weren't the core of the story. The core was what came before. Years of being dependable without being protected. Years of believing that if I stayed reasonable, the system would meet me with care when it mattered. Years of mistaking endurance for security. What this experience taught me, slowly, quietly, and without drama, is that systems don't respond to character. They respond to clarity, documentation, and consequence. Not because they're cruel, but because they're built that way. That realization doesn't mean people are bad. It means responsibility doesn't live where we're often told it does. I didn't need revenge to regain my footing. I didn't need to raise my voice or expose anyone publicly. I needed to stop carrying weight that wasn't mine to carry. The moment I did that, everything shifted. This story isn't a call to be confrontational. It's an invitation to be exact. To notice when your silence is being interpreted as consent. To understand that being easy to deal with can come at a cost you don't see until you're already paying it. There's a quiet power in choosing not to perform reassurance for systems that haven't earned your trust, in asking questions that don't accuse but also don't soften the truth, in allowing facts to stand without cushioning them for someone else's comfort. If you're listening to this and thinking about a time you stayed quiet because it felt safer, I want you to know this. Safety that requires self-erasure is temporary, and clarity, once chosen, doesn't make you harsh. It makes you whole. I don't regret how I handled it, not because it was easy, but because it was aligned. I acted in a way I could live with, long after the emails stopped and the meetings ended. So I'll leave you with this, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts. Have you ever realized, too late or just in time, that being reasonable was costing you more than you were willing to keep paying? If you feel comfortable, share your experience in the comments. Sometimes the quiet stories are the ones that matter most.